You want to give us a good definition of hate speech? Can you?
Welcome to Kingdom of the Logos, a Christian program of critical thinking and adventure. And this is our new program, Spirit of the Constitution, and this is part 2 where we're going to be talking about the First Amendment. I'm Pastor J. Dillon Proctor, and with me here is Tradesman Tyler.
Hey everybody, how you doing?
Well, it's certainly wonderful to have you here, Tyler, and for those of you out in our audience, please subscribe and follow our YouTube channel, and there where we're at on Facebook. It will help us so much if you give us a like and you follow it. It really helps us spread content. But also, give us a little bit of a pass as we're getting sort of the ball rolling on this, and there's going to be some technical issues as we get these things going. But anyways, Tyler, what are we going to be talking about today with the First Amendment?
Today we're going to talk about the First Amendment regarding religion, speech, and the freedom to press.
All right, cool. Well, do we just want to go ahead by jumping right into the First Amendment?
Yeah, let me go ahead and read this off for us right here. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, or abridging the freedom of speech, or of the press, or of the right of the people peaceably to assemble and petition the government for a redress of grievance.
All right, so that's not too long, is it, Tyler?
No, it's pretty short and to the point, but there's a lot of good context in there, a lot of good vocabulary, a lot of strong words that can kind of press through to make sure nothing changes.
Yeah, and that's interesting because I'm glad you bring up the vocabulary of this, because as with the preamble, the diction, the structure of this is quite particular. So let's start breaking it down and seeing exactly what we have going on. What is the first idea we see shared with us here about what Congress can and cannot do?
It looks like we cannot make a law respecting an establishment of religion. People tend to want to say that the church has no say in government, but I think it's clearly the other way around. It looks like the government has nothing to say about religion. They can't do anything.
Yeah, that's one of the things that a lot of times people are unfamiliar with, the history of how our government came together. It was not a bunch of people who were atheist or anti-theist or even agnostic trying to develop a government free of the church. What they were trying to do is keep something different from what was going on in England and in Europe, where you had Protestants and Catholics who were really dueling it out. And for a while, if you were a Catholic priest, you had to go into hiding. If you were a Protestant, you didn't really want to go down into Catholic territory. And there was this huge overlap where there were political people who got their arms in the church, and there were people in the church who really moved away from the point of the gospel, and they started looking at political power, and they started using that to persecute other Christians who were just of a different sect and a different group, and things got really nasty. And they said, you know what? The reason why we came to America, whether it was, look at any of the colonies, almost all of them are a group of Christians coming over here on a pilgrimage. They are looking for the virtues of the gospel that they can take and build a society upon, and they don't want the government coming into that. And that's a really important thing for us to understand about history. It really was, like you said, Tyler, it wasn't so much saying that the church should not have any influence in the government, though that is a flip side of this, but they were saying the government shouldn't have any influence in the church. So they said the two need to just be separate.
Yeah, and you shouldn't be able to prohibit the free exercise either. You should be entitled to do whatever you want to do with your religion, whether it's worshiping a rock or all the way through the first or the New and Old Testament, whatever you want. And you shouldn't be what's the word? Not prosecuted.
Persecuted.
Persecuted. I'm sorry. Sorry, guys. Yeah, you shouldn't be persecuted for your beliefs.
Yeah, and that's a very important
really,
thing, because we see a lot of people in our modern world, they claim victim status, and then they want to infringe on other people's rights, and they don't really understand the constitutional rights. When we look at something like China, what's going on currently, a place that doesn't have something like the First Amendment, and we look even throughout human history in older times, we see places where the government is coming in trying to shut down people's ability to actually exercise their belief. Recently in China, there was a large church named Zion Church, and it's called a house church, but the reason why it's called that is because it's not one of the government-run churches. The government actually runs churches in China, and we'll just leave it that way. I'll let you draw your own conclusions on whether that's a good thing or a bad thing, but they don't necessarily put people in there who are even Christians to be pastors. But there's this church where Zion is there and the people were meeting, and the government went to the people attending this church, the congregants there. They went to their places of work. They called them up on the phone, and they said, we're going to harass you unless you give us a statement saying you will no longer attend the church. They wanted the church to give up its pictures of Jesus. They wanted CCTV cameras in there. And they said, look, we will harass you. The individuals who are Christians going to this church, we will harass you. We will come to your places of employment. We'll try to get you lost from your job, these sorts of things. Unless you will give us a statement, you will not go to church. And that's a really dangerous thing. It's a really scary thing. It's not the first time that's happened in history, but that's the pathway things tend to go if there is no rights or some sort of government trying to protect your rights, which, again, one of the themes that we've been talking about is our rights did not be invented by the government. They were not something which people stumbled upon. They were derived from God, and they were based on New Testament principles, and the government was there to protect them.
You know, I think some of that's actually going on over here to a certain extent. There's a lot of, I guess almost to an extent of persecution of the church again. Like it's people's replaced the church with the state, and now the people that are believing in the state are kind of persecuting the church.
Yes.
You know, like I think we've talked quite extensively about that before, how people's replaced religion, well, not religion, just, God or whatever their belief might be with the government.
I think you're onto something, Tyler, and I think when you immediately said they've replaced religion, I think that's the line of logic that people initially want to go with. And I think even our brains, even people who are Christians, are trained to think by the assumptions of the secular world. The secular world claims it wanted to do away with religion. And even when I was growing up, going through school, you've seen people who are like, well, the separated church and the state, and they would use that to beat up on the church from a government position, which is not at all what that was designed to do. Though a lot of times people in the church, they don't realize you can call people out. You can't beat up on the church if you're in a governmental place, just like they can't promote things. But we see a lot of people say, well, if we just remove religion, there will be no religion. But what actually happened as they tried to move away from the Almighty God, creator of the universe, the one who actually got order and reason and rationality brought to creation, they said, as we move away from him, people will just have no religion. But this was not true. People started putting their faith in other things. And one of the things that I find is if you actually study the behavior, a lot of people who are modern, they're secular, there's a lot of different pagan religions out there that may not brand themselves as pagan religions, but when you look at things like environmentalism and you look at this sort of identity politics, this new idea of intersectionality, there is a paganism that is taking things like your personal identity and turning that into a new religion. And you see it behave a lot like an old Gnostic religion where there are people who say there's hidden knowledge, there's some secret out there, and only certain people are elect and only they have that hidden knowledge. Take, for instance, with this whole idea that is very opposed to intellectual diversity, but it only cares about skin complexion diversity, this thing that says, well, we've got to have those people here because they have a unique perspective. And you look at that and you're like, well, first off, that's a sort of Gnostic heretic saying, like, only that person is elect to have that unique perspective. And also it's deeply, legitimately racist because it says people's minds are contingent upon their skin color. What are your thoughts about that, Tyler?
Well, while you were saying how certain things have kind of become paganistic, could you say that pretty much as long as something exerts control over somebody else, that could almost become a pagan religion? Could you say that?
I think you can make a case for that. And when you say that, I'm reminded of a few different definitions of evil that have existed throughout time. Of course, there's a lot of definitions for sin. You see things like missing the mark or a willful act against a known law of God. But some of the definitions for evil and some of the definitions for violence that we find throughout the history of philosophy and theology is that evil is when you take another's will, another's life into your own control. So basically what you're saying there, where you've got a lot of power and you're wanting to control other people, you know, that is a form of evil and violence that we have recognized when people want to exercise their own will on others instead of saying, looking to the will of God and trying to bring something more powerful than just the normal human condition to the table.
Well, you want to go ahead and edit that part and wrap it and go to the next piece? Or do you have any more to say on that?
I do have one thing I'd like to say on that. One piece of evidence, and I may edit back in here. Actually, I may put a slide or something there before. So, Tyler, one piece of evidence I have that a lot of people are behaving religiously about things which they don't realize are religions is the fact that so many people are reacting as if they've experienced blasphemy. We've got a video here that I want to play of a rather unfortunate reaction that a young lady has on a college campus, and let's take a look at that.
My free speech!
No, they're not. You have to obey the rules of the venue.
But this is free speech if you're so concerned.
Not free
Yes, it
speech.
is!
Please keep your comments. Please keep your comments to the Q&A section.
Keep your hate speech out of this campus.
Keep your hate speech out of this campus! Keep your hate speech out of this campus! Keep your hate speech out of this campus!
Utter madness.
You're not welcome here! Stop talking to us like children! You're not welcome here!
Man, Dylan, isn't it strange? It looks like she's kind of replaced her religion with the state and the state's power to possibly control and regulate your freedom of speech, which is the next topic in the First Amendment.
It is, and it's a religious thing. It's a blasphemy thing. You've said something which is blasphemy, and it must be totally rejected. And I find it so interesting. These people, and we'll go on to the next, I know we've got to get to abridging the freedom of speech, but my final thought is people who are connected to long, ancient traditions, they've been basically told blasphemy is something you should ignore, and there is a reasonable way for us to respond to things which are unholy. There's a rational and mature way of handling this. But yet, these people, with these new religions, they actually want the state to establish their new faith. They want the state, which again, the First Amendment says the state is not going to establish a new religion. They want the state to establish a new faith, and anything that is blasphemy against their faith, they want it shot down. Your thoughts on that? Do you see that happening, yes or no? And then we'll go to abridging.
Oh, man, it's totally happening. It's happening everywhere. Pretty much every topic has been tied back to state control.
Yeah. All right.
So
Well, for time purposes, what do we need to see next? What's the next line?
we need to talk about the ability to say what you want to say. The awesome freedom of speech clause. Bullet point.
Yep. Abridging the freedom of speech. Let's talk about this.
This is something that's very, very, very exclusive to our country. As far as I know, there's no other country that has this written into their constitution. And you can see how, I guess, evil and how bad it can become if you look at like England or Canada or, pretty much any other country around the world. If you disagree with somebody, they can put you in jail forever just for saying, yeah, your shirt's blue, it's not red. That could be considered hate speech.
Mm-hmm.
You want to give us a good definition of hate speech? Can you?
I can't. And that's the problem. I can't find anyone who can. And even if people try to give a definition of hate speech, the whole principle and sentiment behind hate speech is that you are taking something subjective and putting it over things which are objective. And that's what is so bizarre about this. And that is so reverse to the sentiment of this statement here of Congress is not going to be doing anything that is abridging the freedom of speech because it is protecting unpopular speech. It's protecting things which people can interpret different ways. It's saying the government is not going to come in and say what you can and cannot say. Now,
so one thing I'd like to touch on real quick is we always hear the term hate speech as something that needs to be regulated. But you never hear anything about love speech. You never hear anything about just regular speech. It's always the hate speech. And like you said, we can't define it.
As a pastor, and I don't have to say this as a pastor, just any Christian can come to this conclusion. I'm not saying I have some unique perspective here. But as someone who spends a lot of time thinking theologically, and again, anyone in the audience may have come to this conclusion too, I see the secular religion, the paganisms of the modern time, they don't like to say that evil is a thing. They don't want to confess that evil is real, so they've had to come up with an alternative to talking about bad guys. They've had to come up with an alternative to talking about the things which are the wicked and the evil forces of the world, so they've come up with hate speech. That's my hypothesis, that the whole purpose of hate speech has nothing to do with the surface level values that they're talking about. It has to do with the deep-rooted underpinnings of this modern version of paganism, where there's a slot for describing evil and articulating evil that must be filled, but they want to reject the idea that there is actual good and evil in the world. So this fluid, loosely defined, subjective, interpreted as you will, hate speech concept is filling the gap of understanding evil and wickedness. What do you think about that?
I think that's a pretty good way to put it. Yeah, I think so. I can agree with you on that.
I mean, when you see people's statements that say, oh, stop the hate, they talk about things where if they were actually seriously convicted and had a strong moral infrastructure in their life, they would say, that's evil. We don't need to deal with that. But they don't actually want to call anything evil, but they want to try to brand something as bad. So hate is the secular pagan version of evil. In terms of language. I'm not saying that hate is a concept they invented. I'm just saying the way they use that term.
How do you feel about the internet as a whole when it comes to speech?
Well, this is something which, I knew we were going to get there eventually when we talk about the press. But one of the things I think is interesting about the internet and how free speech relates to it is it used to be, if we went back in time, I'm sure you've got some ancestors, some grandfathers, great-grandfathers, where people, they would work hard throughout the day, and the men would go and gather maybe at a storefront, an old country store, or maybe on Sunday, the whole family would come together at someone's house. I know my great-grandmother used to cook dinner for the whole community, but people would come for their chit-chat after they worked to a local situation. Now, a lot of times, people's chit-chat is done online, and the chit-chat is not distributed across many different houses and many different stores where, the head of the household, maybe it's the man that lives there, and maybe it's the great-grandmother who's making dinner. She says, you know what, you're being rude, y'all are fighting, y'all leave, y'all come back next Sunday. Well, they can just pick up and go back to their own house, and they can go to another house or something. We live in a world now where things like Facebook and Twitter, if we're going to be actually honest about it, there's not a viable alternative to them online, and yet they're the place where we go to communicate. There are spheres of communication for a lot of people. And these are institutions which do not believe in the freedom of speech that the First Amendment is trying to teach us about.
Yeah, you can clearly see that. There's been a lot of examples here in the recent few months where people have been banned and shadow banned or just completely knocked off. There might be a soft ban, there might be a hard ban, but I mean, yeah, whatever they deem as hate speech, they can get rid of you. Whereas somebody on the opposite side of the spectrum could say something just as hateful, just as evil, and it's perfectly fine. I wouldn't have an issue with any of those companies if they would just come out and say, hey, we're on this side.
Yeah. And
then you know where you stand. But
right.
You don't even know where you stand. Well, you kind of do now after all the examples they made out of certain people. But
well, let's come back to that in a moment. We'll talk about that when we talk about the press, because I think the answer to that is to stop treating things like Facebook and Twitter and even Google and YouTube as if they are a actual open platform like they claim to be, and start treating them more like a press or a publisher. We'll get to that in a moment, but let me ask you this question, Tyler. Is freedom of speech about protecting mainstream speech, or is it about protecting unpopular and sometimes awful speech?
Unpopular.
Do you think that people today understand that?
No, I honestly, I never really understood it. I guess I kind of took it for granted until the last few years when I started seeing how twisted and I guess kind of revoking the people have been, the press or the internet or whatever, how they tend to kind of revoke that. Now that once I seen it, I realized how important it is that we need that for unpopular speech, because you can't have a dialogue without unpopular speech. Is that correct? Could you agree with that?
Oh, absolutely. One of the things you find throughout history is that new innovations, they typically come from people who are pushing the envelope. They're not pushing the envelope. A lot of times people say, oh, they're trying to destroy the systems around. This isn't usually true. They're usually building off the knowledge around them and their observations of the world and trying to explore taking that further. We see this happening And sometimes it's unpopular, sometimes it's not. But the historical trend is that ideas approved by the state tend to be promoted, and ideas that are opposed to the state tend to be killed off or highly suppressed. One of the beautiful things about America is that we have decided as a nation that we're looking to New Testament values, and we want to protect people's ideas even when they're unpopular, instead of taking people to have them flogged and sent to places to be stoned and thrown on a cross like we see in the early church. People who had unpopular ideas, they were killed. We realized that if you actually want to spread things, the best way of doing that is by listening to the word, listening to the testimony of people, the whole idea of due process, listening to different arguments. This helps the victims out and the perpetrators get closer to the truth and actually getting justice for the perpetrators, making sure they get a serious and real meaningful justice, but also helping to fully bless the people who've been victims of things. Freedom of speech and protecting unpopular speech really benefits everyone, but there's a lot of people opposed to that. Well, do we want to move on to the next bullet point where we talk a bit about, well, what's next for us to talk about, Tyler?
Well, we got the press, and then we got, I guess, the right to assembly.
Okay, let's talk about the press.
Okay.
What is the press? This is a huge question we have because so many times in our modern world, people will look to things, and people who are even in the press, they'll say, oh, well, we're the victims, we're the new heroes. The press is supposed to be something which is a neutral arbiter, though they don't have to be neutral. There's no magic law which says they have to be neutral, and there's no magic law that says they are neutral. And when we see things like Facebook and other social media, they really are functioning more like a editorial newspaper or something to that effect than they are as a telephone line. They claim that they're a utility, but they're really not behaving like a utility. They're behaving much more like a news publication that has its own political leanings, it has its own dispositions, and they're only going to publish things which agree with that.
You've only seen that change, though, in the last 5-6 years. Back when those companies first came out, they were pretty open, but they've definitely set their presence on which side of the fence they're staying on. You know, that, like you said, there's no laws that can make them stay neutral, but they've definitely kind of showed their true colors, that they're not in the interest of free speech.
Do you want me to share my thoughts of why I think they're so dedicated to this?
Sure, go ahead.
I think it's religious conviction. I think they have bought into the modern paganism ideality of identity as the new secret knowledge. If we can just get all the identity box marks checked, and we don't actually care about the content of people's character, we don't value people because life is sacred and people are created in the image of God. They don't value people for any sort of sacred or truly appropriate way of valuing people. They value people based on just their skin complexion and things of that nature. Your superficial characteristics, who are you attracted to? What are you? Are you a man or a woman? Things like this that are just not what we are called to value people on. And they value people on this, and they have their agenda. They have their political things, but it's moved beyond just the political sphere it's got into a spiritual and a religious conviction. And I think that's why they're so motivated to do this. And I think it's why they're so okay with shutting down things they think is hate speech, because they're treating it like it's blasphemy. They want the blasphemous content gone. That's a
really good way to put it. I never thought about it like that. For some reason, I always kind of attributed it to more of, I guess, money. And that seemed to change. Once they got a lot of money, it seemed to change them. But maybe that's just where I was at.
Well, I think
but you might be right.
I think those two ideas go together. Once you get enough money, once you own the market, you no longer have to do it in such a way that builds your market share.
Yeah, you don't have to think about what others want. You can do what you want anymore. Once you got the money.
Power.
Yeah, that's money and power. Yeah, okay, I can see that.
Yeah,
but I mean, what do you think about like some of the mainstream stuff on television? Like, certain sources claim that they're totally unbiased, but there's a clear bias there.
It's clear that they're not. One of the things which really bothers me, I don't like it when people claim they're unbiased when they are. I mean, just be honest about who you are. And I also don't like it when people use the name of God in vain. You see people on all sides of the political spectrum do this. And you see a lot of people, they pick and choose moral virtues that are derived from even things like the Ten Commandments, to claim that they have some sort of moral authority when they're doing it at random. They pick and choose these things, and they're entirely unmorally based. If you only know enough morality to use it as a weapon against people around you, you're probably not very moral. And I see people doing this in their attempt to pretend that they are the unbiased arbiter of virtue, information, and everything like that. And back to what we see happening here in this First Amendment, where it talks about there is a right for a free press. Does that mean that the press has a right to all information?
Ooh, that's tough. I don't know about all information. It would be nice if they could share, I guess, some more some state or government information that we don't really get to know about. That would be nice, but that's a really good question. I don't think I've ever really thought about it like that.
Well, the reason why I bring that up is because when we look at the last two really election cycles, we've seen actually some similar, and let me just restate that, the last two presidential election cycles, so going back from really the 08 to 2016 and the 2016 to now election cycle, you've seen some things go on where similar and yet different things have happened, but yet the mainstream media has reacted totally different depending on who's in office. And a lot of times they claim things are either promoting free speech in the past, and now they're saying, well, they're hurting freedom of speech. But a lot of times it's not because anyone is telling them what they can and cannot say, as much as it's telling them you actually don't have a right to receive all information in the world. You can talk about it all you want. We're not telling you what you can and can't say. We're just saying you don't have a right to every piece of knowledge on the existence. And even in that situation, it's not that they can't even have the knowledge. If you just find it yourself, it's just you don't have a right for us to give you everything at command. I mean, you can ask for things and we can share with you. But if you're just going to play by your own rules, if you're going to be corrupt, well, there's no thing that says you have a right to be as corrupt as you want to be and still have no checks and balances. It's simply the right that says you can say whatever you want and we're not going to come after you. Say whatever you want. That doesn't mean that you are somehow all-powerful and all-knowing. It doesn't mean that everyone has to shut down everything they're doing to come and tell you everything you want to know. It doesn't mean that we're your servants. It just means that you can say what you want without any infringement, without any hesitation, without anybody coming and telling you what to say or what not to say.
I've really got to say, and I'm hoping this correlates with what you're saying. I hate the term fake news, but man, it couldn't apply more. There's so many times you could call them out in one day over the spread of misinformation.
Yes, which comes to the next point I want us to talk about. Does this statement about the press, and again, let me just read it. Let's go back to our First Amendment where it says, Congress shall make no law respecting the freedom of speech or the press, which means the Congress is not going to suppress, they're not going to abridge or shorten what the press can or can't do. But that also doesn't mean that the press can't be corrupt.
Yeah.
There's no magic rule in the universe that says the press can't be corrupt. And while the term fake news is something that's a post-2016 thing, I think it's a word that's actually an ancient concept. When people talk about this old concept called sophistry, and that's sophistry, sophistry is the act of telling things which sound true. They may even be technically true, but they're not actually true. They're not reliable. They're not an accurate portrayal of the world. It may be like coming and saying, well, everyone in church today had on shoes. The reason why people go to church is they have shoes. You'd be like, okay, it's technically true that everyone in there had on shoes, but that's not actually the cause or the reason why people go to church. And that's really what fake news a lot of time is. They find things that are rooted in some actual details of reality, and then they twist it into something which it's not.
Yep.
Yeah.
I guess I've always kind of just had my disbelief in them. It just never seemed too true.
Well, another thing that is also here is the press has no right to tell you how to think either. We should start some sort of movement that says, why don't you everyone think for themselves, you know? Salvation does not come from government. Salvation comes from our Lord Jesus Christ. And by the grace of God, we can receive his mercy. Salvation does not come through the state. And again, the whole reason we're doing this is we want people to realize that. I'm not coming in here to say that America is the kingdom of God and we've got to get it back on track. But in the historical context, America has a lot of wonderful things going on as far as its principles and philosophies. And if we want to live in a wonderful culture, we have to have some sort of moral architecture that we can all come to terms with. So let's go to our next point, because I know we're getting crunched for time. What's the next thing that we wanted to talk about right as we come towards our end, Tyler?
See, I guess it's the freedom to peacefully assemble and petition the government.
All right, so this one is really interesting, and let's take those in two halves. The ability to peacefully assemble. This is the right to free association. In other words, the government can't tell you who you can and who you can't associate with. What bothers me is on a lot of college campuses that are public college campuses, they are by indirect but objectively verifiable and you can actually see them standards. They are saying certain people cannot associate. Do you see things like certain speakers not being allowed to come and things like that? And you see where there's really a mob rule instead of a orderly and organized and objective rule. There's sort of a subjective feelings rule over the right to peaceably assemble. And that's something that bothers me. But, Tyler, what are your thoughts on the right to peaceably assemble?
I think it's a great thing. You should be able to affiliate yourself with whoever or whatever you want to do, as long as there's no, I guess, foul play. There's nothing foul about it. I dislike the fact that college campuses have so much power that they can shut down somebody's, I guess, assembly practice, or the ability to practice assembly. But I mean, I don't know what'll change that. I guess maybe some time, maybe getting different people in there. I'm thinking that some of the youth that's actually in college right now are actually capable of changing that.
I do too. One of the things that my thought is, I just encourage people to go to trade school.
Yeah, well, I guess so. Yeah, it's definitely a different kind of world. We kind of have a little bit of everybody.
Yes.
You know, if you don't make it, you know, kind of weed yourself out. But yeah, we didn't really have anything like that. It was either work and go to school, or you didn't turn out very well.
Yeah, go to trade school, work, get married, have babies, buy a house. It's a good formula.
Yeah, it works.
So the next thing I want us to talk about is that second half there, for people to assemble and then also to express their grievances with the government, so they can actually, complain when they don't like things. People can protest. And one of the things that's also unique about the U.S. Constitution is throughout human history, whenever people have protested, they tend to be, well, we'll say they've been dispatched, typically.
They've been peacefully removed.
Yes. Though peace in this situation doesn't mean anything cute and fuzzy. It usually means something quite brutal. Yeah. What are your thoughts on that? There at the end of
I think that's great. I think a good way to petition the government is through voting and the changing of ideas that way. Excuse me, my dog decided to come up and get some loving.
That's good.
She's protesting me at the moment. Protesting can be great, but I think it should be done, as it states, peacefully. You shouldn't be out smashing cars, flipping stuff over, setting stuff on fire, inciting violence. If you just make your point and go on about your day.
What do you think about people who think that protesting is more powerful than voting? Like, if you get a big enough social media movement, that should have the same value as actually real world action. What do you think about that? Do you see that happening?
That sounds kind of dangerous to me.
It does sound dangerous.
Well, I guess you can look back through all of time, but what sticks out most is what's current, right? So if you look at the current stuff, a lot of it's turned rather violent than it has actually been productive. And I do want to touch on this. It seems like a lot of the protesting has been pretty much based off of lies, not truth.
That is, yeah, and that's where that's the problem with things like hate speech. Hate speech really is a concept that bothers me because there's no objective standard for how it's used. And the whole premise of it is that subjective feelings are more important than the objective truth. And that's just sad. So one of the final thoughts I want to to leave people with as we wrap things up, and I know we're really crunched for time. We'll be wrapping this up. Our government system, which it is flawed. I'm not saying that it is just a pure piece of gold from heaven, but it is based on New Testament principles, such as this idea that you as an individual, you can have personal agency and personal sovereignty. When we look at the New Testament, Christ comes and he says there's no Greek or Gentile, no male or female, no slave or not slave. He looks at all this stuff, and what you see happening is Christ is saying there is no group identity that defines who you are. And the whole reason that Jesus comes, and one of the big things about him going to the cross and dying, is in the era leading up to Jesus's birth, there is the Second Temple period of Judaism, and if people wanted to know God, if you wanted to actually commune with God, people didn't just go to synagogue and pray, but people would make a sacrifice. If you wanted to actually have personal communion with God, you had to make a sacrifice, and it's a big deal. And again, there's rituals leading up to that, and not everybody can really do that. And you find that only people born into a certain tribe, right birth order, and then a lottery on top of that. There's a very, very few people who can have a connection with God. It's not this idea that every individual can have a connection with God. There's a lot of identities, whether you're a Jew or Gentile, what order you were born, all sorts of insanely particular stuff about your identity that would keep you away from God. And Jesus comes and he says, nope, I'm going to die. I'm going to be the one sacrifice that means every one of you, no one has to do any more sacrificing because you can all come to God through me. And one of the whole philosophies, if you just take that logic, you just take that little piece of the New Testament's DNA, you find there's this logic that individuals, not collectives, not I'm saved because I'm a Samaritan and Jesus talked to a Samaritan woman, not anything ridiculous like that, but this idea that I have received the testimony of Christ, I've been transformed by it, and now I am saved. I want to come into the kingdom of God, and by the power of God, he's revealed himself to me, and the Holy Spirit is coming to transform me and sanctify me. There's an individual transformation that allows people to be in the collective body of the kingdom. There's a personal decision which brings you into a collective body. Yes, there's a collective role, and we all do work together in the kingdom of God. But it's not this pathological collectivism that we have today where people are looking for some sort of existential salvation in their identity and their groupthink. And we even find people in the church who want to buy into this paganism, which doesn't see God as God, that says, oh, we've got to play this whole identity politics game, and it really does bother me. It breaks my heart because it ultimately is going to end up biting everyone in the face that ends up playing this game. Well, Tyler, any final thoughts before we close?
No, I think I'm good. I'm ready to get on to the Second Amendment.
All right.
That's a fun one.
Well, we'll be looking at that next week. And thank you all for joining us. Again, please come check us out. If you really enjoy our content, please comment. Send us your thoughts, your questions, and all of your opinions on what we say. You can find me on Twitter at @JDylanProctor. You can find us on YouTube at Kingdom of the Logos, on Facebook at Kingdom of the Logos. If you really want to help us out monetarily, you want to help pay some of the bills we have, go to patreon.com/Kingdom of the Logos. Yes, we're a new program coming along, but please help us out. Just sharing our content will be the best thing you can do right now. On that, God love you and have a blessed day.